Hello, fourth grade. Miss Harris here. We are going to talk about direct quotations today. So whenever we are reading a story, we can tell that one character's talking. We can tell who's talking, or when it goes from one character to another character talking by quotation marks. When a character is speaking, that's called their dialogue. What they're saying is called their dialogue. So today we're going to look at this PowerPoint and talk about some different rules for whenever you're using direct quotes. And we're going to work through exercise 1 in your junior analytical grammar book together. So the first slide that I have up here says, Lily said, I think all kids should have their own iPads. So who's speaking here? That's right, it's Lily. It says Lily said. Now when we are writing this, you will write a comma after said, and then the quotation marks go around everything that Lily said. So before I, and then after our period, we have our quotation marks. Our period goes inside of our quotation marks. Now we have another sentence that says, we can start school an hour later, John suggested. So who's talking in this dialogue? That's right, it's John. But this time, John is at the end. So we start our sentence with a capital letter. We have our quotation marks around what John said. So we have quotation marks at the beginning of our sentence here. We can start school an hour later. Then we have a comma after later, and then our quotation marks. Then at the end of the sentence, John suggested, we put a period. Now, looking at your junior analytical grammar book, if your sentence, if it's written like this, and your sentence should end in a period, you turn that period into a comma and put your period at the end of the sentence whenever the person's speaking at the end. But if it's an exclamation point or a question mark at the end of that sentence, then you put the exclamation point or the question mark here, and then John suggested, period. I do have some examples of that we're going to look at. The next one would be a broken quote. So if the quoted sentence of a dialogue is divided into two parts, the second part of the dialogue begins with a lowercase letter. So Peter is talking in this sentence. He says, school will be fun. Peter shouted. Well, he doesn't say Peter shouted, but our sentence says, school will be fun, Peter shouted, if we get free milkshakes every Friday. So our sentence is broken in two. So this is called your broken quote. So the first part that Peter says is in quotation marks. School will be fun, comma, quotation marks. Peter shouted. Now this is still part of the same sentence, so it doesn't start with a capital letter. So Peter shouted, comma, then you start quotation marks again. If we get free milkshakes every Friday. So Peter shouted is not in quotation marks because Peter is not saying Peter shouted. But we're reading that so that we know that he's really excited when he's saying it. He's shouting it. Quotation marks show direct speech, which means the exact words of the speaker. A new paragraph is used every time you have a new speaker. So as you're reading your Lassie Come Home book, you'll notice that every time a different character speaks, it starts a new paragraph. Even if the character just says a sentence and then another character starts talking, it's a new paragraph every time a different character starts talking. So your direct speech consists of two parts. The speaker tag, that's just saying who is saying the sentence, who's speaking in the sentence. And then the dialogue, which is the actual words being spoken. So our speaker tag here is Amy declared. And then the words that are actually spoken are your dialogue. I'm happy when there's pasta on the menu. So you'll notice there's a comma after Amy declared. And then you start your quotation marks. You start with a capital letter. I'm happy when there's pasta on the menu. Then you have your end mark, which is an exclamation point here, before you put your quotation marks. Speaker tags help us understand who is speaking and how they are speaking. So Amy declared. So she is telling us it's her opinion. I'm happy when there's pasta on the menu. And then the actual words, they are enclosed by quotation marks. The first word begins with a capital letter, and then there's a punctuation mark before you add your closing set of quotation marks. And here are some examples. You have your quotation marks at the beginning and the end of the sentence, and a comma after Kelly shouted. School is already really cool. So you have everything that Kelly said is inside of quotation marks. And this is another example. Amy stated we should write less tests. So who's speaking here? Amy is speaking here. And what did she say? She said we should write less tests. So everything that Amy says is in quotation marks. So notice where your quotation marks are on this sentence. You have a comma after Amy stated, quotation marks before the first word that Amy says, and then quotation marks after the last word that Amy says. Quotation marks begins with a capital sentence, just like a regular sentence. So here's an example of that. Peter said, I'd love to do more art. So this sentence is what Peter said. You start it with a capital letter. Okay, now every direct quote is going to end with a punctuation mark. It can be a question mark, an exclamation point. You're going to put or a period. You're going to put your punctuation. Remember to put your punctuation and then your quotation marks, your ending quotation marks. Here's an example. Jack shouted, it would be nice if we could start every day with music. So whenever this sentence is written, Jack shouted, comma, then it's the start of the sentence that Jack said, so it starts with it starts with a capital letter. You put the quotation marks around everything that Jack said. And where does your punctuation mark go at the end of the sentence? Is it before or after the quotation marks? Right, it's before you add your last quotation marks. Okay, so when you're writing quotation marks, and you read about this yesterday in your junior analytical grammar book, but it can be written in 3 ways. Okay, it can be at the beginning of the sentence, which we went over a lot in this video. So after the speaker tag is Kelly shouted, you're going to have a comma, and then you have your spoken words, which are going to be within that the quotation marks. Here's an example. Kevin mumbled, "Holidays should be much longer." So Kevin mumbled, comma. Holidays starts the sentence of what Kevin said, so it's a capital letter, and it ends with an exclamation point. We put the exclamation point inside the quotation marks. Okay, the speaker at the tag, if the speaker tag is at the end. So if you are saying what the speaker is saying before your speaker tag, that means your speaker tag is at the end. Now, if you have your junior analytical grammar book out with you, I want you to go look on the second page of your reading section on D. And I'll pull that out right here. This right here, D. Suppose you are writing a sentence which begins with dialogue and ends with narrative, which is your speaker tag. And then suppose that your dialogue is a statement, which would end with a period. Okay, this is how you would think you would normally write it, but it can be a little bit confusing with the period. So, if the sentence ends with a period, you change that period to a comma. So it would be written like this. "I wish I could go to the state fair, comma, said Bob." And then you have your quotation marks around what Bob said. Okay, you only changed that to a comma if the dialogue comes before the narrative or the speaker tag. And you only change it to a comma if the sentence ends with a period. If it ends with a question mark or an exclamation point, you leave it there. You don't change it to a comma. So here's an example where it ends with an exclamation point, so you do not change it to a comma there. So school is already really cool. And that's with an exclamation point, so it stays there. If this sentence ended in a period, we would be changing that period to a comma. We only do that when the dialogue is first and the speaker tag, the person speaking, is at the end of a sentence like this, said Kelly. Here's another example with the speaker tag at the end. "Why do we have to answer all these questions?" asked the little boy. So who's speaking in this sentence? Right, the little boy. So he's asking a question. Everything that he says is in quotation marks. Why do we have to answer all these questions? And he's asking a question, so it ends with a question mark. And the quotation marks go around everything he said, including the punctuation mark at the end of the sentence. Okay, if the speaker tag is in the middle, that's what our junior analytical grammar book calls the broken quote. So it starts with a quote and it's broken up. The speaker tag's in the middle and then it ends with a quote. Let's practice that. I'd like school more, said Sarah, if we could eat cake in class. Me too, Sarah. Okay, so I'd like school more, comma, because we're not finished with what she's saying. But Sarah doesn't say said Sarah. So we add our quotation marks around what she said here. And then no quotation marks around said Sarah, comma, if we could eat cake in class. Now this is not starting a new sentence, so we do not capitalize this if. Okay, that's where we're going to end on our PowerPoint. But now let's turn and look at direct quotations exercise 1. And we're going to work through this slowly together. Let me get a pen. And our directions say, in this exercise, we have to put the quotation marks in. So all the other punctuation marks have been put in, and we only add the quotation marks. So read each sentence below carefully and insert quotation marks where you think they should go. So sentence number 1 says, Bobby looked at his best friend Jason and asked, do you ever think about being a grown-up? So our comma is already here. Our end punctuation marks here. We just have to add our quotation marks. So we have to think to ourselves, what did Bobby say? What's he saying? And Bobby's saying, do you ever think about being a grown-up? So do is where we start putting our quotation marks. And then he quit talking after he said the word grown-up. Now, do I put my quotation marks before my question mark or after? Right, you put it after. You always put it after your punctuation mark. The punctuation mark is part of the sentence, so you include it in the quotation marks. Number 2, yeah, said Jason. It's kind of scary, isn't it? So this time it's broken up because Jason says, yeah, it's kind of scary, isn't it? But Jason doesn't say, said Jason. So you already have your comma here, but we have to put quotations around yeah. Then he also says, it's kind of scary, isn't it? Now, it's is capitalized in this because it's starting a new sentence. Number 3, there's a lot to learn, said Bobby. You have to learn about money, for example. Do you ever save money? Okay, this is another broken quote because said Bobby is breaking up our dialogue, is breaking up what he's saying. So there's a lot to learn would be in quotation marks. And then you have to learn about money, for example. Do you ever save money? So he says all of that. So I'll put quotation marks around all of that. Number 4, my mom and dad pay me for doing my chores, said Jason, but I have to save 1/3 of it for college and 1/3 of it for gifts. I get to spend the rest on whatever I want. So Jason says, my mom and dad pay me for doing my chores. So I'll put my quotation marks there. And then he also says, but I have to save 1/3 of it for college and 1/3 of it for gifts. And he also said, I get to save the rest on whatever I want. So even though that's more than one sentence, he said it all together. So I just have to do one set of quotation marks, a beginning an end set of quotation marks. And number 5, "That's a good idea," exclaimed Bobby. "I think I'll talk to my mom and dad about that." So Bobby says, "That's a good idea." Notice my quotation marks are after my end mark, my exclamation point. "That's a good idea," exclaimed Bobby. "I think I'll talk to my mom and dad about that." So that's what Bobby said. Now, tomorrow we're going to go through exercise 2 together, and I realize this video is running longer than planned. So what I want you to do is try to find the 5 errors that are in this part on your own. And at the beginning of the video tomorrow, we'll go over this before we review and get into exercise 2. So I hope you guys have a good evening, and let me know or day. Sorry, I'm recording this in the evening. Let me know if you have any questions, or contact me if you need help with anything. Bye, guys.